The cabin was gone. Every neighbor within 3 miles had lost something that week. A roof caved in under the weight of the snow, a chimney cracked by the freeze, a wall that simply gave up. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit and kept falling. Livestock were moved indoors. Wells froze solid. Families huddled in whatever structure still held. But one family hadn't moved at all. They weren't in a cabin. They weren't in a barn. They were inside something that had no business keeping anyone alive in that kind of cold. A massive steel cylinder, half buried in a hillside, sealed at one end with scrap timber and river clay. From the outside, it looked like salvage, like desperation. A neighbor who passed by that morning later recalled shaking his head and muttering something about fools and iron coffins. By nightfall, that same neighbor was standing in 2 inches of slush with nowhere to sleep. The family inside the cylinder was warm. Not survivably warm. Not barely holding on warm. Warm. The kind of warmth you feel in your chest. The kind that lets children sleep through the night without extra blankets. Oral accounts from the following morning describe the air near the cylinder's sealed entrance as noticeably different, softer, heavier, compared to the brutal open air just steps away. No one understood it at the time. The man who made that choice hadn't studied engineering. He hadn't read about thermodynamics or convection or radiant heat transfer. He'd simply looked at a shape that others had dismissed as junk, and understood something about it that no one around him had thought to ask. What did he see that they didn't? And why does the geometry of that cylinder matter more than almost any material you could build a wall from? That's exactly what this video is going to show you. Stay with it, because the answer isn't where most people look. If you're new here, subscribe and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We read every single one. There's a particular kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a blizzard or a dramatic drop that sends everyone scrambling for firewood. It settles in quietly, a degree here, a degree there, until one morning you wake up and the water bucket beside the stove has a skin of ice on it, and you realize the walls of your cabin are no longer keeping pace with what's happening outside. That was the winter of record in this part of the frontier, a season that local oral accounts would describe for decades afterward simply as the bad one. Temperatures that had hovered around 20 degrees Fahrenheit in early December began a slow, relentless slide. By mid-January, nights were regularly hitting 5 degrees Fahrenheit. During the worst stretch, a 10-day period that old-timers referenced as the Iron Week, the thermometer outside the general store reportedly dropped to -8 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there. The land itself seemed to stiffen. Creeks locked over. The ground rang hollow underfoot, frozen to a depth that no pickaxe could manage. Trees cracked in the night with sounds that woke children from sleep. Not breaking, but contracting so violently in the cold that the wood split along its grain like a rifle shot. And the cabins built the way everyone built them, the way fathers had taught sons and neighbors had copied neighbors, began to fail. Not all at once. Not dramatically. They failed the way underpowered things always fail under sustained pressure. Slowly, then completely. First the drafts came. Cold air found every gap between logs that the summer chinking had not fully sealed. Then the interior walls, the ones farthest from the fireplace, began to sweat condensation that froze solid by midnight. Families moved their sleeping pallets closer to the hearth. Then closer still. Then they were essentially sleeping inside the firebox's glow. Burning through their winter would supply at a pace that had not been planned for. 3 families in the valley ran out of split timber before February. One relocated entirely to a neighbor's already crowded home. Another burned furniture. A third tore apart a chicken coop, board by board, to keep the main stove alive through the final weeks of the cold snap. The problem was not the fire. Everyone had fire. The problem was the box they were trying to heat, and how badly that box was designed to hold on to what the fire gave it. A standard frontier log cabin of the era was essentially a rectangular container with a single heat source at one end. The fire blazed, the air near the hearth warmed, and that warm air, being lighter than cold air, rose immediately to the ceiling and pooled there, useless and unreachable, while the floor stayed cold and the far corners of the room never warmed at all. The walls, built from logs that conducted heat outward as efficiently as they conducted it inward, acted less like insulation and more like a slow drain. Every hour of burning produced an hour of warmth that the structure was quietly bleeding away into the frozen air outside. This was the fundamental flaw that nearly every family on that frontier shared, and nearly every family suffered for it equally. Nearly every family, because at the far edge of the settlement, up the hillside, past the last fence line, one man had looked at the problem differently from the beginning. He hadn't built a rectangular box. He hadn't followed the pattern. When his neighbors had started laying corner logs in the fall, he had walked away from the timber pile entirely and gone looking for something else. What he found would not make sense to anyone who saw it. Not at first. Not until the cold came and refused to leave, and the numbers made themselves impossible to argue with. His name, according to regional homesteading records from the period, was Callum Reed, though whether that name was given at birth or adopted at some point during his migrations westward is unclear. What the records do agree on is the outline of his situation in the autumn before that brutal winter. He was land poor, timber poor, and, by his own admission in a letter preserved by a local historical society, not willing to repeat the same mistake twice. The first mistake had been the previous winter. Callum had built a cabin that first season the same way everyone else did. Rectangular, notched log walls, a stone hearth centered on the north end. He'd follow the pattern because the pattern was what people followed. He'd spent more than he intended on iron hardware, less than he should have on chinking compound, and arrived at February with a structure that kept him alive, but not much more than that. He described that winter in his letter as burning wood to make smoke rather than heat. By his own rough accounting, he had consumed nearly 4 cords of firewood between November and March, and still woken up on 12 separate mornings to find ice inside the cabin, within 8 feet of the stove. 4 cords. That's roughly 512 cubic feet of split, seasoned hardwood, for a single man in a small cabin. And it wasn't enough. That summer, while his neighbors began planning additions to their existing structures and arguing about the best method for daubing log gaps, Callum walked the property looking for a different answer entirely. He wasn't an engineer. He had no formal education in materials science or thermal physics, but he was, by all available accounts, a careful observer, the kind of man who notices things and sits with the observation long enough to ask why. What he found that summer was not on his property at all. It was abandoned on a stretch of scrubland about 2 miles northeast, a massive iron cylinder, roughly 9 feet in diameter and nearly 14 feet in length, lying on its side in the grass. Local accounts suggest it had been part of a failed industrial venture in the region, possibly a boiler casing or a section of industrial tank, hauled in during an optimistic season and abandoned when the venture collapsed. It weighed, by rough estimation, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,500 pounds. Moving it was not a casual undertaking. Callum spent the better part of 3 weeks building a timber skid and recruiting 2 neighbors, both of whom thought he had lost his mind, to help drag the thing into position on his hillside, using ox power and a great deal of profanity. When it was in place, he began the work of turning it into a home. He dug the downhill in partially into the hillside, about 3 feet of burial, to give it a stable foundation and take advantage of the earth's insulating mass. He sealed the buried end with a combination of stone, clay, and salvage timber. At the open end, he built a fitted door frame from hardwood planks, installed a heavy door with leather hinges, and packed the seam with compressed moss and river clay. Then he cut a small hole, no larger than 6 inches in diameter, near the top of the sealed end and fitted it with a short iron pipe to serve as a vent. His neighbors watched all of this with a mixture of curiosity and open skepticism. One oral account, collected by a local historian in the following decade, recorded neighbors saying, "We figure he'd freeze solid in there by Christmas." It wasn't a house. It was a barrel. It was, in a sense, a barrel. But it was a barrel that Callum Reed understood in a way no one around him did. And the physics he was working with, without knowing the names for any of it, were about to prove every skeptic wrong in the most conclusive way possible. Before we can understand what Callum's cylinder did for heat, we need to understand what it was built to do in its previous life, because the two things are more connected than they might appear. Industrial cylinders of the mid to late frontier era, boiler casings, pressure tank sections, kiln drums, were engineered for one fundamental purpose: to contain and manage energy. Whether that energy came in the form of steam pressure, combustion heat, or chemical reaction, the design goal was always the same: hold it in, distribute it evenly, release it in a controlled way. The walls of these cylinders were thick, typically between 1/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch of iron or early steel, depending on the application. That thickness was not accidental. It was the result of engineers calculating exactly how much material was needed to absorb, distribute, and gradually release the thermal and mechanical stress of sustained high-energy operation. In other words, the cylinder was, by its original design, a thermal storage device, not a passive one. It had been built to actively participate in the management of heat. When Callum hauled that cylinder onto his hillside, he was not repurposing a piece of scrap metal. He was, without knowing the vocabulary for it, acquiring a pre-engineered heat sink of considerable capacity. Here is what that means in practical terms. Iron has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.11 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. A cylinder of the dimensions Callum was working with, 9 feet in diameter, 14 feet long, walls approximately 5/16 of an inch thick, contains somewhere in the range of 2,800 to 3,200 pounds of iron. Run the numbers, and you find that this structure could absorb and store a substantial quantity of thermal energy before its interior temperature climbed to equilibrium with the air inside. In plain language, it took a long time to heat up, but once it was warm, it took a very long time to cool down. This is the central principle: thermal mass. And it is the same principle that makes a cast iron skillet hold heat long after you remove it from the flame, the same principle behind the massive stone walls of medieval European structures, and the same principle that indigenous builders in cold climates had understood and applied for centuries in their own way, with their own materials. The cylinder was not magic. It was mass, and mass, in the physics of heat retention, is one of the most powerful tools available to anyone trying to stay warm through a long, brutal night. But there was a second property of the cylinder that Callum could not have calculated, and that his neighbors certainly never considered. It was the shape. A cylinder, as opposed to a rectangle, has no corners, and corners, in a heated interior space, are where warmth goes to die. Cold air is denser than warm air, and in a rectangular room, it settles and pools in the corners and along the floor, creating a permanent thermal gradient that no amount of fire can fully eliminate. The warm air rises to the ceiling where no one benefits from it. The cold air stays at floor level where everyone lives. Inside a cylinder, there are no corners for cold air to anchor itself. The curved walls redirect airflow continuously, creating a gentle, natural convection loop that moves warmer air around the perimeter and back across the living space. The heat circulates rather than stratifying. The floor stays warmer relative to the ceiling. The entire interior tends toward a more even temperature distribution. Callum didn't have a name for convection. He didn't know why it worked, but he had spent one winter in a rectangular box watching warm air pool uselessly above his head while his feet went numb. And he had decided, with the intuition of a man who observes carefully, that the shape of the box mattered. He was right in ways that would have taken a trained engineer considerable effort to fully explain. Let's slow down here and make sure this is completely clear, because this is the part of the story that most people miss entirely, even today. When we talk about keeping a space warm, we tend to focus on the source: the stove, the fire, the fuel. We asked how hot it burns, how long it lasts, how much would it takes. These are reasonable questions, but they are, in a sense, the wrong questions, or at least incomplete ones, because the source of heat only matters in proportion to the structure's ability to capture and retain what that source produces. A fire burning in an open field produces enormous heat. It warms no one standing 20 feet away. The same fire in a sealed iron cylinder heats every square inch of interior surface it touches, and those surfaces begin radiating that heat back inward to every person sitting within reach. This is the difference between an energy source and a thermal system. Callum had stopped thinking about the fire and started thinking about the system. The cylinder's geometry contributed to that system in three distinct ways. First, surface-to-volume ratio. A cylinder of Callum's dimensions enclosed a living space of roughly 890 cubic feet, adequate for a family of four to move, sleep, and work. The interior surface area of that same cylinder, the walls, the sealed end, the packed ceiling, totaled approximately 480 square feet. Every inch of that surface, once warmed by the fire and by radiant heat, became a radiator. The family was not sitting near one warm surface. They were entirely surrounded by warm surfaces. The heat came from every direction simultaneously. Compare this to a standard frontier cabin of similar interior volume. It would typically have 4 flat walls, a flat ceiling, and a flat floor. The heating source, a single fireplace or iron stove, might directly warm one wall and a fraction of 2 adjacent walls. The far wall could remain 10 to 15 degrees colder than the near wall for the entire duration of the fire. The ceiling could trap air that was 30 degrees warmer than the floor. In a cylinder, these gradients flatten dramatically. Second, the elimination of thermal dead zones. Every rectangular room has them. The space behind furniture, the far corners, the area beneath windows. These zones accumulate cold air that the natural convection pattern of a rectangular room never fully disturbs. In a cylinder, the convection loop that forms as warm air rises and circulates along the curved walls continuously sweeps the interior, displacing cold pockets before they can establish themselves. Oral accounts from the Reed family describe the floor of the cylinder as not cold, a distinction that anyone who has spent a winter in a log cabin will recognize as significant. Third, structural continuity. A rectangular cabin is held together at its corners. The structural joints where the most heat loss occurs through conduction and air infiltration. The corners are also where the chinking is most likely to crack, where logs are most likely to shift with freeze-thaw cycles, and where wind-driven cold air finds its easiest path inward. The cylinder had no corners. Its structural integrity was continuous around its circumference. There were no joints to fail, no gaps to form, no corners to defend against infiltration. The only vulnerable points were the sealed entrance and the vent pipe, both of which Callum had addressed with clay, moss, and tight-fitted hardwood. The result of all three factors working together was a thermal efficiency that no rectangular log cabin of the same era could match under equivalent conditions. Based on the principles involved in plausible estimates from similar documented structures, a well-managed fire inside the cylinder, burning for 4 to 6 hours in the evening, could raise the interior temperature to somewhere between 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 74 degrees Fahrenheit. And crucially, the iron walls, once charged with that heat, would release it slowly across the following 8 to 12 hours, keeping the interior above 50 degrees Fahrenheit through the entire night without any additional fuel. No cabin in the valley could make that claim. None of the neighbors who watched Callum haul that cylinder up the hillside had done the geometry. They had looked at the shape and seen absurdity, a pipe, a barrel, a piece of industrial junk. They had not asked what the shape was doing. They had not wondered whether a curve might be smarter than a corner. The cold, as it always does, would eventually ask that question for them. There is a tendency, when imagining a man living inside an iron cylinder, to picture something crude and improvised. A small fire burning on the dirt floor, smoke filling the space, the family huddled near whatever warmth they could get. That image is wrong in almost every detail. Callum Reed did not build a campfire inside the cylinder. He built a stove, and the placement of that stove, the precise decision about where it sat inside the curved iron shell, was what transformed the cylinder from simple shelter into a functioning thermal engine. The stove itself was modest, a cast-iron box, roughly 18 inches wide and 24 inches long, salvaged from a homestead that had been abandoned 2 seasons prior. It had a flat-top surface for cooking, a small firebox with a hinged iron door, and a short flue collar at the rear where a pipe section could be attached. By itself, it was nothing unusual. Thousands of identical stoves were in use across the frontier at the same time, sitting in rectangular cabins, doing exactly what stoves in rectangular cabins do, heating the air immediately around them while the rest of the room stayed cold. What Callum did differently was where he put it. He positioned the stove not against the sealed back wall, not in the center of the floor, but roughly 1/3 of the way in from the front entrance, slightly off-center toward the lower arc of the cylinder's interior curve. This placement, which oral accounts suggest he arrived at through simple trial and error during the autumn before the cold set in, turned out to be precisely where a thermodynamic engineer would have chosen to put it. Here's why. When the stove burned, it heated the air directly around it. That warm air, being lighter than the cooler air in the rest of the cylinder, began to rise. In a rectangular room, rising warm air hits the flat ceiling and spreads outward in all directions until it cools and sinks, creating a vertical convection loop that is shallow, inefficient, and quick to stagnate at the corners. But inside a cylinder, the curved ceiling redirected that rising warm air differently. Instead of hitting a flat surface and spreading laterally, the air followed the curve, rolling upward and around the interior arc, moving along the upper wall, and then descending again along the opposite side of the cylinder. The result was a continuous, circular convection current that swept the entire interior perimeter, top to bottom, without stagnating at any point. The stove's off-center position amplified this effect. Positioned slightly toward the lower arc, the firebox sat closer to the iron wall than it would have in a center placement. Radiant heat from the firebox, the direct infrared energy emitted by the hot iron surfaces, struck the curved wall within 18 to 24 inches and immediately began charging that section of the cylinder's thermal mass. That section of wall then radiated heat inward and laterally around the curve, warming adjacent sections of wall, which in turn warmed the sections adjacent to them. Within 2 to 3 hours of sustained burning, the effect had propagated around nearly the full interior circumference. The stove's flue pipe, a section of salvaged iron pipe roughly 4 feet in length, rose from the firebox collar and exited through a sealed hole near the top of the cylinder's front face, just beside the door frame. Callum had packed the pipe penetration tightly with fired clay to prevent cold infiltration around the joint. The short flue length meant that a significant portion of combustion heat that would normally be carried straight out of the building in a conventional chimney setup was instead radiating into the interior from the pipe surface itself before escaping. Oral accounts suggest the pipe section inside the cylinder ran warm to the touch for 2 to 3 feet of its length, a secondary radiant surface that most conventional stove installations simply did not have. The net result, a fire that consumed between 1/4 and 1/3 of a cord of wood over a 4 to 6 hour evening burn, produced a thermal output that saturated the iron walls of the cylinder to a sustained radiating temperature. When the fire died and the firebox cooled, the walls did not. They continued their slow release, steady, even surrounding, for the better part of the following 10 hours. The stove was not the heater. The stove was the charging mechanism. The cylinder itself was the heater. That distinction is everything. The test did not announce itself. It arrived, as the worst tests always do, without warning and without sympathy. The first week of February brought a change in wind direction that the older settlers recognized immediately. The wind shifted from a northwest to due north, dry, unbroken Arctic air funneling straight down from the open plains with nothing to slow it. Temperatures that had been hovering between 10 degrees Fahrenheit and 18 degrees Fahrenheit for the past several weeks dropped sharply over the course of a single afternoon. By sunset on February 4th, the thermometer at the general store read -3 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, it had reached -11 degrees Fahrenheit. By the coldest point of that night, somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, according to local accounts, the temperature outside had dropped to what witnesses described as the worst cold anyone present had ever seen, with estimates ranging from -14 degrees Fahrenheit to -17 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill made the effective temperature significantly lower still. In the rectangular cabins of the valley, families were awake. Not by choice, by necessity. The cold was breaching walls, finding gaps that had held all winter, driving drafts through chinking that had seemed solid for months. People burned fuel they had been rationing. Some ran out. Fires that had been banked for the night had to be rebuilt from cold ash at 3 in the morning, hands shaking, children crying from the sudden drop in interior temperature. One family later reported that their interior wall thermometer, mounted 4 feet from the stove, read 38 degrees Fahrenheit at its lowest point that night, despite a fire that had been burning for 2 hours. 38 degrees. Inside, with a fire burning. On the hillside, the cylinder sat in the same wind. It felt the same outside temperature. The same Arctic air pressed against its iron skin. There was no fire burning inside it. Callum had let the stove go out at approximately 9 in the evening, as was his habit, preferring to let the charged walls carry the heat through the night rather than burn fuel unnecessarily. He had been doing this since November. The walls had never failed him yet. What makes this night remarkable in the reconstruction of this story is that one of Callum's neighbors, a man who had helped move the cylinder into position the previous summer and who had remained quietly curious about it throughout the winter, made his way up the hillside the following morning with a simple alcohol thermometer. He had been recording temperatures inside his own cabin through the worst of the previous night, and he wanted a comparison. Callum let him in. The interior temperature of the cylinder, recorded at approximately 7 in the morning, roughly 10 hours after the stove had been extinguished, was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The outside temperature at the same moment was -6 degrees Fahrenheit. The neighbor's own cabin, with a fire that had been burning for 2 hours before the reading was taken, showed an interior temperature of 46 degrees Fahrenheit at the same time of morning. The numbers stood on their own. No argument was needed. A sealed iron cylinder, with no active fire burning, in the coldest recorded night of the winter, maintained a livable interior temperature 10 degrees warmer than a neighbor's actively heated log cabin. The family inside had slept through the entire event. The children had not woken. The water bucket near the door, the one that froze solid in the log cabin every time the temperature dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside, still held liquid water. Callum reportedly said nothing when his neighbor read the thermometer and went quiet. He simply put the kettle on the flat top of the cold stove and waited for the residual heat in the iron around him to bring it to a boil. It took a while, but got there. Word travels fast in a settlement where everyone has been awake all night. By the time the sun was fully up on February 5th, the temperature had begun its slow climb back towards single digits above zero, and people were emerging from their homes to assess the damage. Roof sections had been compressed by ice load and snow accumulation. One chimney stack had cracked through at the mortar joint, rendering the fireplace beneath it unusable until repairs could be made. Several families had lost significant portions of their firewood reserves in a single night, fuel they could not easily replace with winter still weeks away from breaking. And then the neighbor with the thermometer began talking. The account of what he found inside the cylinder spread through the settlement the way surprising information always spreads among people who have just endured shared ordeal. Quickly, imperfectly, and with a great deal of embellishment added along the way. Some of what was said was accurate. Some of it grew in the retelling. But the core fact that the family inside the iron cylinder had slept through the worst night of the winter without a fire and had woken up warmer than the cabins around them was not disputed. The reactions, as recorded in fragments of oral history collected by regional chroniclers over the following decades, were varied and revealing. Some neighbors were openly embarrassed. These were practical men and women who had looked at the cylinder the previous summer and dismissed it without serious consideration. They had an investment, financial and emotional, in the methods they had chosen. Admitting that a salvaged industrial tank had outperformed their carefully built log cabins was not a comfortable thing. Several reportedly said nothing at all when the story was recounted to them. Their silence, those who were present noted, was louder than any argument. Others were genuinely curious. They asked Callum direct questions about the stove placement, the vent pipe, the way he had sealed the door. He answered as best he could, not in the language of engineering because he didn't have it, but in the language of observation. He told them what he had tried, what hadn't worked early on, what he had adjusted. He told them that the walls themselves got warm if you burn long enough. He told them that once they were warm, they stayed warm longer than any wood wall he had ever known. A few were openly skeptical, even after the thermometer reading. They attributed the result to luck, or to the density of the iron blocking the wind in a way that had nothing to do with heat retention, or to the hillside position sheltering the cylinder from the worst of the gusts. These objections were not entirely without logic. The hillside position did offer some wind protection, and that factor was real. But it was not sufficient to explain a 10-degree interior temperature advantage over an actively heated structure in the valley below, especially 10 hours after the fire had gone out. What the morning after the coldest night of the winter did, more than anything else, was end the laughter. The jokes about iron coffins and barrels and madmen on hillsides had stopped circulating by the time the community gathered to help repair the cracked chimney. Not because people had been persuaded by argument. Callum had never argued. He had simply built something and let the winter make his case. The winter had made it. Clearly, numerically, irrefutably. And in that particular community, in that particular moment, the evidence of a thermometer read at 7 in the morning on the coldest night of the decade was a more persuasive document than any engineer's report could have been. Walk through any new residential development built in the last 50 years, and you will find the same thing repeated, with minor variations from one house to the next. Rectangular rooms with flat ceilings, forced air heating systems that push warm air through vents near the floor or ceiling, walls insulated with fiberglass bats or spray foam rated for thermal resistance, but not for thermal mass, and windows, large, beautiful, thermally catastrophic windows, positioned on whichever wall faces the street, regardless of solar orientation. It is a system that works. In the sense that people do not freeze, it absolutely works. But it works the way a car with a fuel leak works. As long as you keep adding fuel, the destination is reachable. Stop adding fuel, stop running the furnace, lose power for 12 hours in a February ice storm, and the interior of the average modern home begins dropping toward ambient temperature within a few hours. Not because the insulation fails, but because the walls have no stored heat to release. They're vapor barriers and wind stops. They're not thermal mass. They never charged up. They have nothing to give back. Callum's cylinder had no insulation in the modern sense. It had iron walls, a clay-sealed door, and earth against one end. By the R-value standards that modern building codes use to measure thermal performance, it would have failed spectacularly. Iron conducts heat far more readily than fiberglass bat. The R-value of a 3/8-inch iron wall is effectively negligible, and yet it kept a family warmer through a harder night with less fuel than the insulated log cabins around it. The reason is that R-value and thermal mass are not the same thing, and conflating them, which modern residential construction has done almost universally, produces buildings that are excellent at slowing heat transfer, but poor at storing and releasing it. A high R-value wall slows the flow of heat outward. A high-mass wall absorbs heat inward and holds it in reserve, releasing it slowly over hours. The ideal structure does both. The typical modern home does only one. The engineering tradition that understood this distinction, that knew how to balance thermal resistance with thermal storage, was not lost through ignorance. It was displaced by economics. Mass costs more to build than insulation. A wall of rammed earth or stone or dense masonry requires more material, more labor, and more time than a wood frame wall with fiberglass fill. As construction became industrialized and speed became the dominant value, mass was the first thing to go. What went with it was the building's ability to buffer, to absorb the day's heat and release it through the night, to carry a family through 10 hours of minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit without a fire, without a furnace, without a grid connection, without anything except what its own walls had stored. Callum Reed did not know the vocabulary for any of this. He did not know what R-value meant, or what specific heat capacity was, or why the curve of his walls was more efficient than the corners of his neighbors' cabins. He knew that he had been cold one winter, and that he had looked at a large piece of iron with a different question in mind than anyone else had asked. The question was not, what is this good for? The question was, What does this already know how to do? The cylinder already knew how to hold heat. It had been built for exactly that. Callum had simply been willing, desperate enough, curious enough, stubborn enough, to trust what the object itself was telling him. Modern construction has largely stopped listening to materials. It specifies performance targets, selects products rated to meet those targets, and assembles them according to standardized methods. The result is predictable, scalable, and efficient by the measures used to evaluate it. But on the coldest night of the decade, with the power out and the furnace silent, the house that knows how to hold what has been given will always outlast the house that simply tries to slow down what it is losing. Callum Reed's cylinder was the former. Most of what we build today is the latter. That is the lesson that one winter on a hillside made undeniable, and that a century and a half of building science has been quietly, slowly, circuitously working its way back toward ever since.